Well, without further ado, then let me introduce you to our wonderful presenter, our first presenter of the day, Krista Flannigan. Krista is an attorney. She's an advocate who is so experienced in emergency response and management in media relations, community collaboration, and program development. She's currently the director of the Institute for Crime Victim Research and Policy at Florida State University, and she is a tremendous asset and leader with the Office for Victims of Crime Technical Training and Assistance, who we love as one of our partners as well. So we are so thrilled to have her with us today to talk to us about a trauma informed response. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And Krista, we're thrilled that you're here, and I will turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marcy. And I want to begin by saying good morning, everyone. I'm joining you from Tallahassee, Florida. I'm at the Florida State University there. And I just want to begin by saying I really appreciate Linda's words of gratitude. I personally begin every day with acknowledging what I am grateful for. And I'm certainly grateful to be here with you all today. And I am grateful for all that you do as advocates, as handlers, and just advocating for people that are in crisis. So thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint, and we'll be talking about trauma-informed care, obviously. Let me do that. Go ahead and do that. Hopefully you can see my screen. And so let me just ask you as we discussed trauma-informed care, and if you just can put this in the chat too, if you'd like, about what is it that you think trauma-informed care is? What does that mean? I mean, many of you are victim advocates. It's kind of what you do every day. So what does it mean to be trauma-informed from your perspective? And you can just go ahead and put your thoughts in the chat, and I'll go ahead and move forward. So when we look at, being trauma-informed, that it's important that we sort of recognize or realize, that trauma affects people differently. Even if there is a shared incident, such as domestic or mass violence, or even if you're looking at a shared type of victimization, such as domestic violence or sex assault, that people have different life experiences, resiliency, as well as different support systems. And we have to realize that. We also have to realize that there are vulnerable populations, many of whom who've had a personal history with trauma or generational trauma. And also that trauma can impact a person's long-term emotional responses, physical responses, cognition, etc. For example, like an individual who's experienced trauma might react in what we would say seemingly normal situations in ways that don't make sense really to other people. What seems like a common interaction may actually reactivate an individual's trauma and make them feel as though they're back in the crisis situation. So how we interact with people that have experienced a crisis is really important, because we don't want to reactivate. And finally, being able to respond by utilizing our knowledge and understanding of trauma in our daily functions of work, and to also really be actively aware of what those potentially re-traumatizing behaviors could be and try to avoid those. So trauma-informed care it's important to recognize that it's not therapy, that this is an approach that recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma, and it works with victims where we find them emotionally. And it's really focusing on a strengths-based framework that and understanding the impact of trauma and all of the different reactions, and trying to operate that way as individuals, but really looking at it programmatically too, that programs and services and systems have an understanding of trauma, so that there's kind of that sort of no wrong door approach related to how victims are treated in a trauma-informed way. So what does trauma-informed care offer? Well, it's going to, whatever our desired outcomes are, which if we're working with crime victims, we want to try to minimize their trauma, right? So that's what trauma-informed care does, is it offers that desired outcome. And it supports trauma recovery by being trauma informed and providing information in a supportive from emotional and with their experiences. And also a key component to trauma informed care is recognizing the impact of the work that we do on ourselves and that vicarious trauma, because we really cannot be thoroughly trauma informed unless we acknowledge our own trauma, and it can and also will help us in decreasing our vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. So the importance of creating a trauma-informed culture is that even when we're helpful, even when we're friendly and respectful to our clients, they might not respond to us in ways that that we understand. They also might be responding really to past trauma that they still carry with them. So we need to keep that in perspective. So part of understanding being trauma informed is to say, well, what is trauma? How do we define trauma? Well, the definition that we're going to operate off of today is that trauma is the experience of an inescapable, stressful event that overwhelms one's coping mechanisms. So incidents or experiences that are shocking, terrifying, or overwhelming. And this results in feeling fear, horror, helplessness. And these trauma activating incidents may also include witnessing an incident, some sort of sensory exposure, which can happen through the media, and all of the different ways that the media is available to us now. So traumatic incidents are incidents that are so extreme, they're so powerful, harmful, and or threatening that they demand extraordinary coping mechanisms, extraordinary coping efforts. There are often a multitude of incidents that happen over time. It could be complex, prolonged trauma, interpersonal violence or violation, especially at the hands of an authority or trust figure, is really especially damaging. But it can also be from a single incident, such as an incident of mass violence or a natural disaster. So there are similarities in the characteristics of a traumatic incident, that they're unpredictable, that they're overwhelming, and that creates that sense of powerlessness for the person who is impacted by it. Now, the differences between a criminal incident and a natural disaster is that, even though we can say that there are common elements, that we could say that there is some unpredictability, but oftentimes with natural disasters, we have more of an ability to predict when they will happen, many of them. When we look at a hurricane that's coming or a tornado, that we can prepare for those. And we teach people how to respond to those types of incidents. And it does create a feeling of powerlessness, but with natural disasters, oftentimes people as a whole, as a society as a whole, we are given the tools and the resources about if we live in an area. So I live in in a hurricane community. So we get information all the time about how to prepare for a hurricane. And so even though when it happens, you feel a little bit powerless, we're given tools. But for crime victims, that's not the case. We don't prepare ourselves for becoming a crime victim, because oftentimes this happens with no warning, and people don't like to think about the fact that they could be crime victims. I mean, we think about ways that we can prevent a potential victimization, but we don't prepare ourselves for what would happen if we were actual victims of crime. Another major difference between natural disasters and crimes is really looking at the impact on responders. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but when we look at first responders, and that would be you in that category as well, is that we do see that there is a longer longer term reaction, even more post-traumatic stress we see with first responders of crime, of criminal incidents, particularly incidents of mass violence, than we see with natural disasters, et cetera. We also see that there is more prolonged trauma for crime victims than there are victims and survivors of natural disasters. So let's talk about trauma as in how we function sort of in day-to-day life. So normally we exist with this equilibrium of stress, right? We never have a day that's stress-free. And we're going to talk a little bit in a minute just about different types of stress. But we have both positive and negative stressors in our lives. We can have, that maybe a graduation, a wedding, a new job, a raise, all of those are positive things, but they create some stress and some stress reactions. But usually day to day, we're able to balance those out, and function normally. Now, occasionally, though, that we're going to have some stress that is severe and that will take us out of that equilibrium, and might put us in a temporary state of depression or anxiety. But most people, most of the time, stay in that familiar range of equilibrium. And even if we're thrown out of that equilibrium, we can get back to that, depending on the nature of the stressor. So when we look at the different types of stressors, there's positive stress where that has, or we look at that increased heart rate, mild elevations in stress hormone levels, like we spoke about, with things that we think are good, but it still creates these physiological reactions in us. Then there's tolerable stress, which can be serious and temporary stress responses, but we also, even if the stressor itself is a little bit more serious, that oftentimes we have support mechanisms or maybe even outside support that can help us regain our equilibrium. Now, toxic stress is something that is a prolonged activation of a stress response, and that maybe those protective relationships aren't in place, or at least aren't maybe established right away, that it's going to take a while, and that the stress itself is incredibly extreme and overwhelming. So when trauma occurs, it throws people so far out of their range of equilibrium that it's difficult for them to restore that sense of balance in life. So trauma can be precipitated by different types of stress. We were talking about stress. So trauma is a stressor for sure, but it can also be precipitated by other types of stress, such as acute stress, which is sudden, arbitrary, and often random. Also chronic stress, which occurs over and over again, each time pushing the individual towards the edge of their state of equilibrium or beyond. And then developmental stress, which comes with those transitions that we have in life. All right, so actually, before I go to this, I want to do a little disclaimer here, okay? I might have a doctorate, but I'm not a medical doctor. So I'm going to be spending some time talking about the neurology of trauma. And I just want you to know that I'm going to be explaining the brain function in very rudimentary terms. So I'm going to apologize ahead of time to anybody who is a medical professional. Okay, so that's my disclaimer. All right. So what I'm showing you here is a PET scan of a healthy brain. So I just want you to notice and look how smooth it is and kind of intact. Now, this next image is a brain that has been impacted by stress. And I just kind of want you to notice that there are, the holes that are throughout the brain. Now, I don't want you to panic that the brain can heal. Actually, the brain is ever changing. And recovery is possible, but it has to be done with effort. On its own, it's not just, kind of left to its own devices and the stress isn't dealt with. The brain will continue to look like this, and this will then impact the brain function and the ability for us to think and to reason and to be kind of emotionally rational. But with particular types of therapies, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, that it can heal and go back to that smooth image. So let's talk about what happens with the brain when stimuli comes in. So normally in a normal cognitive process, we have stimuli that comes in, and it goes, everything that happens, every piece of information goes to our amygdala. And that's kind of our warning system that will say, whether something is a danger or not. And so it goes to the amygdala, and then it will go and it says, okay, it's not a dangerous thing that we need to worry about. So we get this organized, it goes to our cortex. And that is where we have this organized, interpreted thinking, logical thinking. And then we'll put some emotional context on that through our limbic system. Okay, so we go to the amygdala, then we think about it, and then we put emotions on it. It happens in an instant. Now, when there's a trauma, though, it goes backwards. It still goes to the amygdala first. So then the amygdala says, danger, danger, danger. And instead of going to the cognitive component, it goes to the other parts of our brain, and it will go down to to our limbic system. And so the emotional pieces are there that will trigger the some other reactions where cortisol kind of takes over, our hippocampus kicks in, and that that these emotional and physical reactions sometimes can override our cognitive processes. By the time that all of this gets to that our cortex, that the emotion is all scattered and it's hard to put reason to it. So it's oftentimes difficult for people to have what we would consider normal rational thought. And this certainly impacts memory. And related to crime victims, this is particularly important because a lot of times people believe that to talk to a victim right after an incident, that's when you're going to get the most accurate information. And yeah, you're going to get some, but they're still in that traumatized brain scattered piece. So when I'm training law enforcement, I say, you need to go and talk to them later too, after things have had an opportunity to settle down, because traumatic memory does disorganize an individual's thinking. So the brain's threat default response is really to pump up and flood us with adrenaline and cortisol and oxygen, like I said. And if there was like let's say there was an actual physical threat, like there's a tiger threatening you, and this causes that rational part of the brain, actually, as I said, to kind of take a back seat. So, everybody's heard of that kind of fight or flight and response, fight, flight, or freeze response. And this is not really a description of behaviors. It's really kind of a scientific term for when the brain's threat alert and fear center, that amygdala that I mentioned earlier, it identifies that threat to your well-being and activates those physiological changes, and it releases the stress hormones, the cortisol I mentioned, to make the body deal with that physical threat. And this can happen in an instant. And this is actually a design flaw, unless though the physical threat is real. So if someone is being attacked by a mugger or a predator or car crash, something that requires that blood flow to come rushing through our major organs and to prepare us to be physically strong to deal with it. But where the design flaw comes in is because most of our modern world threats are social. And if we look at, especially if we look at the longer impact of crime, that maybe in the instant of that victimization, that is necessary, that bump, for that physical survival, but the trauma is still being addressed in our brain after the physical crisis incident is over. And I don't know if you know this, but our prefrontal cortex, or that rational part that I talked about, is only 10,000 years old, while the amygdala, our fear center, is millions of years old. So that just kind of puts it in context for us, that we're going to go to fear first. So with social threats, that we prefer to have a cool and rational brain, the prefrontal cortex to kick in and be stronger than our emotional center within our amygdala, right? But in order for us to really evaluate that threat in a rational way, that our brain's default response is going to be with that physical threat, and to pump us up and to act as though we are continually being physically threatened, because we still identify that. And oftentimes this can leave a person with sort of this emotional reasoning, rather something like, I feel bad, therefore it is bad. And of course, it disturbs the body's relaxed balance. And when a person trembles or blushes, and they become unfocused or panicky, leaving them unable really to cope with and it can be with any type of trauma, whether it's real or imagined. And I see this oftentimes with victims after the fact, where especially that feeling of guilt, that, well, if I hadn't done this, if I hadn't been there, or maybe if I hadn't picked up the phone, and so that can be where we could say that is sort of that imagined sort of trauma that they're putting on themselves, but it's real for them. And this can happen at different levels. So we can, and what that creates is this threat can be the threat status of low, medium, or high. High being an actual panic attack, and low to moderate being more of a normalized state for many people, or maybe even an anxiety disorder. The real physical disorder can only be managed effectively through knowledge and deliberate application of learning to think differently. So that's where we're talking about that cognitive behavioral therapy. So what does all of this mean? So we're talking about the brain, all right? So let's break this down simplistically. The left brain is our thinking part, where we use our words, our sequencing, our linear thinking, facts, and logic. Our right brain is feelings, imagination, intuition, visualization. This is where our trauma is stored. Typically, we talk to people left brain to left brain, but that's ignoring the trauma that's in the right part of the brain. So part of acknowledging the right brain trauma memory is to normalize the effect of the crisis. And this is identifying the pattern of what we call what would be a trauma reaction. And this is different than a trauma response. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But really, what we have to recognize is that we all have this, that we all have trauma reactions. It occurs in all of us. And what it is, it's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. Reactions are different from responses. Responses, we can have a little bit more of a choice, that we can choose to respond, where reactions are just automatic, and we don't really have a choice. So trauma is also can be accompanied by a multitude of losses, control over a person's life, bereavement, grief, etc. And we can also grieve over the loss of things as well as people. So there are a lot of losses that we can be considering when we're talking about trauma. So quickly, different types of trauma reactions that we can be looking at. I've talked a lot about, so let's talk about what they are. So there are those physiological and physical reactions where we have the adrenaline rush, that extraordinary strength, that survival response, fight, flight, or freeze, that we can be looking at. Physical senses become heightened, or maybe they shut down. It can be one or the other. Heart rate increases, hyperventilation, sweating, general increase in muscle tension, shivering, sweating, as I said before. Cardiovascular heartbeat is increasing. So those that are susceptible to cardiovascular problems may be more susceptible to heart attack. Also, our body slows down its metabolism, believe it or not. Sometimes people think that it speeds up, but our body is in survival mode, so it's trying to figure out how to protect us. Also, things like headaches, stomach upset, weight loss, weight gain, higher susceptibility to illness, tunnel vision, anxiety attacks, etc. Our cognitive reactions can be things like those trauma-related thinking and memory patterns, forgetfulness, inability to integrate memory and a cognitive understanding of the life story, disassociation, confusion, memory problems, being disoriented, replaying the incident over and over again, distressing dreams, etc. Emotional reactions can be grief, depression, fear, vulnerability, guilt, anger, irritability, regression in behavior, so feeling childlike and weak, wanting someone to take care of us. Also, let's look at behavior changes. Behavior changes can be things like being suspicious and cautious, repetition of the story, rapid mood changes, antisocial acts, being suicidal, intense startle reflex, alcohol and drug abuse, regression, hypervigilance, inability to retain or initiate healthy relationships or intimate relationships, changes in activity levels with eating, sleeping, work, recreation, etc. Also, we know that there's spiritual trauma reactions, and this is kind of questioning one's higher power and asking if individuals asking, am I being punished? Am I being tested? What kind of higher power would allow this to happen? Feeling anger, abandonment, sometimes feeling that loss of connection, or sometimes we see people that actually are connecting with their faith or reconnecting with their faith. And we've also seen that people will find faith for the first time. So there are different types of stress. And I just want to talk about this briefly because oftentimes people think that victims have post-traumatic stress, and that's not true. Actually, not all victims or survivors are going to suffer from long-term stress reactions. Long-term stress reactions are natural responses of people who've survived a traumatic incident, but really what we look at is many victims will continue to re-experience trauma reactions due to activating incidents that remind the victims of the trauma, such as maybe the date of the crime, or birthdays, holidays, special songs, special events, etc. So that's normal. But people can also, when they've survived a catastrophe, have these trauma reactions for years and have more of a complex trauma, which is not necessarily common, but it's not unusual. And these can really be looking at a person's change in their personal self-concept and could ultimately lead to suicidal threats on the extreme. Now, again, this doesn't mean post-traumatic stress. This post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental condition that is triggered or activated by a terrifying incident, either by experiencing or witnessing it. Symptoms can include flashbacks, nightmares, severe anxiety, uncontrollable thoughts, intrusive thoughts, and many people who go through a traumatic incident may have temporary ability to adjust and cope, but with time and with good self-care, they can usually get better. If the symptoms get worse and last for months or even years and interfere with day-to-day functioning over a long period of time, this is post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD affects about 3.5% of adults every year, and estimated about 1 in 11 people have PTSD in their lifetime. Approximately 20% of victims will experience PTSD, but listen to this statistic, 35 to 50% of first responders will experience PTSD. Important thing to keep in mind. Another piece too, just to remember that trauma can't be cured. We can look at the intensity of trauma reactions decreasing over time, but the effects of it cannot be cured. But we can recover. I know it's like, oh, doom and gloom. What are you talking about, Flannigan? No, we can recover. It's about establishing that new equilibrium, reestablishing trust, reestablishing the recognizing that, that there is a future, finding meaning in things, and redefining what is normal. I hear this, and I'm sure many of you that are victim advocates hear this from victims. I just want things to be normal. And we have to look at that differently, right? That it's not, things are never going to be what they were prior to the incident. So it's redefining that. People can see, as they are recovering from trauma, some character changes and looking at redefining their life goals and values, that they might see increased patience and tolerance, flexibility, new purpose and meaning. That's what we hope for. But we can also see, without that appropriate intervention and trauma-informed care, that their coping skills actually become impaired, and that they might become more rigid, or their coping skills that they were relying on that weren't effective, that they will utilize those again and again. And that they will not be able to retain or initiate any positive relationships if they do not have healthy recovery. One of the things that we do know with traumatic incidents is that it can establish resilience, and that is looking at the idea of being able to positively respond to one's changing environment. So, all right, now you know about trauma. What does this mean? Now, what do you do? What do you do with this information? How do you create a trauma-informed response? Well, one of the things we have to remember is that the benefit that we have as responders is that that's what we can do. Advocates can respond. Victims react. They don't have control over what's going on with their with how they are coping. With tools, they can gain that, absolutely, that they can learn to respond as opposed to reacting. But we have an advantage that we can respond. And so we can respond in a trauma-informed way. And so what that means to be trauma-informed, and victim advocates, I'm preaching to the choir. I know you know this. But it's a paradigm shift for others, that it's kind of looking at what has happened to you rather than saying what's wrong with you. It is victim-focused, it's not victim blaming, and it's trauma-focused, not incident-focused. And it is also providing looking at addressing provider trauma as well as a part of this, because we cannot help others unless we help ourselves. So our core principles of trauma-informed care are awareness of that everyone knows what trauma is. They have an understanding of what we just talked about, that they understand that personal and physical safety is important, that we have to be trustworthy with those that we are interacting with, and with that, we have to maintain appropriate boundaries. Folks we're working with are not our friends, they're our clients. When I go into a community related to that's had an experience of mass violence, that's not my community. It's their community. I'm there to support them. When I work with victims, they're not my victims. They're individuals that I'm there to support. We have to maintain our boundaries. We have to recognize that there is client choice, and we have to respect that, and because that helps give them control, because crime takes that away from them. We have to recognize that collaboration is important, and sharing information with the client and sharing that power with the client too, because that gives them power. when we are collaborating with the client and collaborating with other providers as well. And this helps to empower the people that we're working with, and enhance their skill building. We want to treat every interaction as an opportunity for engagement and to continue to establish and build our rapport. There really isn't a script to follow. We just have to know that that each communication needs to be trauma informed. There are certain things we want to avoid, and we'll talk about those, because we want to make sure that we respect people and treat them with dignity. And so how do we do this? Well, one of the things that we want to do is that we want to listen. We want to say what is being said. We want to pay attention to what's being said to us, what is not being said to us, and how it is being said. I teach college students, and one of the classes that I teach has to do with verbal communication. And I will tell them, sometimes how you say things is just as important as what you say. So you want to see if there's a disconnect between body language and verbal communication. We also want to be able, and when we're trauma informed, to be able to inform people about what it is, what we have that might be able to be helpful to them, what's going to be happening next, why is it important that they have this information, and what kind of services are available to support them. We have to remember that also for us, that it's not just what we say, but how we say it, and that providing information to someone on a piece of paper is valuable, because trauma memory isn't going to remember everything that we say, but oftentimes that voice that we give, and that creates a feeling that is just as, if not more important than the actual words that we are saying. So when we talk about what are the words, what is it that we can say? Well, let's first talk about what we can't say, because you got to use your words, but let's avoid certain words. Okay, so there are things like, I know how you feel. You don't know how they feel. Even if you have been a victim of crime, even if you have been a victim of that particular crime, you might have a perspective that you can relate to because you've had a similar experience, but you're not that person. You're not in their shoes. And so we have to be careful of that. Understand what you're going through, asking questions why, any kind of those accusatory questions. Well, what were you doing there? Why did you do that? Why did you say that? Those kind of things. Comparing the people that we work with other victims that we worked with. Making statements like, any kind of religious platitude, such as it was God's will. Minimizing or invalidating the person's trauma by saying, you know what, it could be worse. You were lucky. You thank goodness, you survived, you could have died, kind of thing. That is not, especially, if they say that, certainly we can validate it, but that's not something for us to say as providers. To tell people too, hey, this is what you need. What you need to know is, what you need to do is, we have to offer that in a different way. Get over it, get on with your life. You're not the only victim that I'm trying to help. And even to say things like, the offender is a really bad person. That's not helpful either. If that person wants to ventilate that, we can let them do that. That's part of our role, right, as advocates. Also to show any type of sympathy really to the perpetrator of the incident is also not supportive of them and can be invalidating. It can be received a different way. Also telling people to move on, that they need to get over it, get on with their lives. Also making any type of guarantees. I promise that this is what's going to happen. We can't promise anything. We don't know. Even if we've seen the same thing happen over and over and over again, you never know, right? Things are unpredictable, even our system, or I should say, especially our system. Kind of that whole idea of saying this is what you ought to do, by saying, if I were in your shoes, this is what I do. Again, you're so strong, you're lucky, any type of those platitudes. And also a big one that I hear about is forgiveness. And that's up to the individual as to whether or not they want to forgive. And that's a very personal choice for them. But for us to say that they should forgive is not being trauma informed. And also that whole idea that time heals all wounds, that's for that person to determine themselves. We know that from what I just said to you is that time can reduce the intensity, but victims don't want to hear that at the time that the incident is occurring. Other types of terminology we want to avoid are things like it's an accident or an event. Call it what it is. It's a disaster, it's a crime, it's a homicide. Or when I'm talking about mass violence, I'll say that it's an incident. Avoid the word closure at all costs. This is a bad word. There is no such thing as closure. People can move from one stage to a next. There might be a part of an experience that has closed. So let's say the criminal justice system, but it doesn't give a person closure. No. What it does is it might give them, it may or may not give them a sense of justice. It may or may not give them a sense of peace. But what closure does is it makes the person feel like that something has come to an end. And so therefore things are going to go back to the way that they were. It really minimizes and invalidates what a victim is experiencing. And those of you who work with victims, you know that. You've probably heard that there's no such thing as closure. Your life has changed forever. I had a victim one time tell me that, that it is kind of like that we're living in a book, that, what the chapter that we're in now was impacted by the preceding chapters, and the one we're in now is going to influence the following chapters. But our book never ends until our life does. But then our book is it opens up in other people's lives that we have been a part of. So really there is no closure. Also, anniversary, we hear this usually related to the marking of the criminal incident. That will say, it's the 1-year anniversary, the 2-year anniversary. We want to try to stay away from that terminology because that really represents a celebration. And really, we're looking at more of a commemoration or an acknowledgement, a remembrance of that event or incident, excuse me. Also, we want to avoid the word trigger, where you're trying to change, because that's kind of that's a word that, especially if someone's a victim of gun violence, that's associated with a weapon. So looking at something activating or reactivating. So when we talk about trigger reactions or trigger events or trigger responses, that we're looking at reactivating or activation. I'm also thinking about the words victim or survivor. This always comes up. We have to go with what does that individual want to be called? Usually in the immediate aftermath, a person is okay with being called a victim. And as time moves on, though, that they might prefer the terminology of as a survivor. So we follow that individual's lead. Also, just a word about reunification. And I say this for any of you that ever have the opportunity to respond to an incident of mass violence. A center that opens up right after an incident has commonly been called a reunification center. We are getting away from that terminology, because what that means to a lot of victims is that if they're told go to this reunification center, they believe they're going to be reunited with their loved one. And oftentimes this is where death notifications occur. So we're stepping away from reunification and calling it information and notification. Also remember that silence can be powerful, but sometimes, and especially for those of you, when many of you that are here, you're handlers, you have a tool that you can utilize where there's not a darn thing you need to say. And you have a powerful tool at your hands with your canine, and there's a lot of power in that. And so sometimes that is the best thing that we can do, is let them do their work, right? So what's some terminology that you can use instead? How can I help you? And all of this you'll have it's available as a handout. That I'm sorry this has happened, that it's not your fault. Asking if they're safe, do they have somebody to talk to? What kind of referral would they like? Offering to make calls. Asking if they need anything else. Sometimes even offering it, because oftentimes people in crisis don't know what they need, but there are things that that they need, like a Kleenex, water, a place to stay, a safe location, whatever, to be connected to people that they care about, to remind them that they're not going crazy, because that's oftentimes what they hear, to let them know what they can expect from you in the future, or that they won't see you again, but there are other people that will be contacting you, whatever it might be, because information can be powerful. If you don't know the answer, don't make it up, but let them know that you'll find out, or make sure that someone will get to them with that information. If you make any types of promises, and make sure that you follow through with those. Using terms like we talked about, incident as opposed to event or accident. Using terms like acknowledgement or accommodation as opposed to closure. We acknowledge something has happened and we accommodate our lives accordingly. And if we don't understand something, that ask for clarity, and just to say, I just want to make sure that I'm clear that I understand what it is that you said, and so that I can be most helpful. And there are others that I'm sure that you have examples of. And if we were in person, I'd be asking you. If we had more time, I'd be asking you. So we have to be sure that we use a language that the person recognizes that we want to be using. And that means their speaking language. So if at all we're dealing with somebody who is speaking a language other than English, if we don't speak that language, it would be helpful to bring somebody in that does, who's also trauma informed. You can use a translator, but if you have, it's better to have somebody that's trauma informed, and also to be using terminology that's familiar and comfortable, that you're not speaking in, using professional acronyms, et cetera. And if a person isn't ready to talk, we don't want to force them to do that, but rather just be open to be able to talk with them at another time. And then remembering a person's cultural context. Avoid making assumptions. If you don't know, ask. And actually, people really appreciate that, because the last thing you want to do is be disrespectful, and then that turns them off altogether. We want to be able to, given the time constraints, to let the person tell their story, to give the time to tell their story, let them lead, and respect their voice and their choice. Consider again from their perspective, and be aware of our own body language, facial expressions, as well as our tone of voice. We want to be careful about touching people. And usually people that are victims of personal crime, that's something that we want to avoid altogether. And when we think about or we take their lead, actually. And body language is important because we have this, going back to my brain stuff again, because here I am, act like I'm a neurologist, that there's this whole idea of mirror neurons that we have. And this is where a mirror neuron is a neuron that fires when both an animal acts and when an animal observes the same action performed by another. So we have a tendency to do what the observer is doing. So if we are communicating with a calm voice and our body is relaxed, that the person who is communicating with us will often mirror that. We want to be careful that we don't mirror their anxiety or trauma or sadness or whatever that might be. We want to kind of model what it is that we would hope that they could mirror. Now, related to trauma-informed care for victim advocacy, we've got a lot of victim advocates, so you know this, but just for those others, that the trauma-informed victim advocacy is addressing safety and security, ventilation, validation, and preparing and predicting. And we talk about safety and security. You're probably all very familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, and it's really looking at those two bottom rungs: that survival, food, shelter. Does the person have food? Do they have a place to go? And are they going to be safe where it is they feel safe and secure? And making sure that we're able to provide that, because if we can't address that, we can't go any farther. That's part of the trauma piece, that they're trying to function, and that their the brain isn't going to allow them to be thinking rationally until those safety and security needs are addressed first. So then giving the opportunity for survivors to tell their story over and over again if they need to. And each time it might take on a different form. Occasionally the differences will be due to those memory problems because of the trauma memory. Sometimes it's going to reflect what's important to the individual at that time that they're talking to you. It's important to be a compassionate presence. You want to be thinking about, again, those tears, or I'm sorry, the touching, that you don't want to assume that it's okay to touch. Again, being careful with how the tone of voice that we utilize, and using those effective listening skills. And when we validate, that we have to be looking at that commonality of reactions, being content specific, and apologizing if we use words that are upsetting, and avoid those cliche phrases that we spoke about, and really to avoid our own personal experiences. And even if we're asked, we want to make sure that this isn't about us, it's about them. Even if they say, has this ever happened to you before? How do you, has this happened to you? And if it has, you can say yes. And then if they say, well, how did you experience this? You put it back on them and say, we all experience things differently. So it's important that we focus on you and turning that back to them. So preparing and, predicting is one of the most critical concerns of survivors, is what's going to happen next. It's not unusual for financial issues to be a paramount concern. Serious physical injury can result in hospital or medical bills, therapy bills, etc. It's also important that victims understand, if it's a crime, what the criminal justice process is, what those terminology is, and it has to be repeated over and over and over again. Following up with some written materials is really helpful. And be thinking about, if this is something that's being covered by the media and how the media can impact that for a victim, and being able to help a victim prepare for any type of media input or involvement. I want to be able to leave time for questions, but really, really quickly, just in a couple of minutes, I want to just touch on that whole component of self-care for the providers, because that is a key element of trauma-informed care. And really what we're looking at is kind of that whole idea of dealing with our own stress and acknowledging that the work that we do is stressful and that stress causes disease. And that, and that we need to, we have the power to kind of make some choices because we are responders. We also have to recognize that trauma is contagious and that it's inevitable, and it's normal for us as responders to be vicariously traumatized. It does not mean that we're not doing our jobs well. It does not mean that it's a sign of weakness at all. It means that we are we're human beings, and that we are being impacted by the trauma. It's not direct trauma. I always kind of like to compare it to standing on the edge of a pool, and let's say we were all together, you all jump in, I don't, I get just as wet as you do just by being there. So it's the kind of that similar analogy. And that vicarious trauma is different than burnout. Burnout is not inevitable. It usually has to do with the systems that we work in that are not supportive to the work that we do, although the reactions can look the same. And vicarious trauma can lead to blocks for us to be trauma informed. And we don't want to do that. Even if we start trauma informed for vicariously traumatized, we could stop becoming that way because we are traumatized. There are ways that we can reduce our trauma, and I encourage you at any time that you have an opportunity to do a vicarious trauma training to please do that. And also through OVC-TTAC, that we do provide those, and can go into all of this in a lot more detail too, because this information about trauma-informed care is more than 45 minutes, 45, 50 minutes can allow for. But if you are interested in hearing more about this and talking about it in more detail within your agencies, please let me know. Happy to do that, and service, and it's available for free too through OVC-TTAC. So I know I've only got a couple of minutes, but I do want to turn this over to any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Krista. That was wonderful. And you're right. That was amazing in 45, 50 minutes, what you just shared with us. Are there any questions? Please feel free to put those in the chat. I guess one question that I would have for you, Krista, is could you tell us how our agencies could request you to do that trauma-informed training that you just mentioned?
Sure, absolutely. You can go to OVC-TTAC, TTACK, or AC, I'm sorry, TTAC.gov. And there's a form in there, and then you would go into the mass violence piece, and then you can request, or even through OVC-TTAC, and then you could request me if you wanted, but there are others that do the training as well.
Awesome. Thank you. And I just put that in the chat. And
Great.
those trainings are free. I certainly use those every chance I get. It's very, very helpful. And it's amazing the level of trainers that you can get, like Krista, that can do something for your organizations. I'm looking in the chat to see if there's any other questions.
Oh, okay. I see a question. Do you find it better to have two people interviewing a trauma victim versus one person? Depends on what your purpose is. What is your goal? If you're there just to provide support, one person is fine. If you're there to get information kind of connected to the criminal justice system, it may be helpful to have two. So, again, it depends on the purpose, and also really what are your resources as well.
And
One
another
person is fine.
Sorry, didn't want to interrupt you, Krista. Yeah. So another question came in though that I want to make sure we get to, and that is, how do you take care of yourself, Krista? Tell
Lots of
us.
wine. Lots of wine. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. You don't want to do that. You don't want to do that.
No.
I walk. I love the outdoors, and I really will take moments of silence. I mean, even to myself personally, that I will just be someplace and be quiet. And that really gives me a lot of peace and comfort, and taking care of myself physically is really important. and I have wonderful people that are in this field that I can talk to, because sometimes it's important that you want to be able to talk to somebody that you can relate to, that has an understanding, and they know that their role is just to listen and not try to fix it, where sometimes our partners that we have want to try to fix it for us.
Yeah, it's so true.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and it's definitely done with the best of intentions, but
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
I know in this field, and myself included, it's really hard for us. I mean, it's beyond hard. It's hard to even articulate the words about self-care.
I
But we
saw
have
this
one more
question,
quick question.
yeah,
Yes.
about empathy versus compassion.
Yes.
This is a much
Yes.
longer discussion because I feel very strongly about this. I believe that you are probably all empaths, otherwise you wouldn't be doing this work. But being empathetic is to put yourself in someone's shoes, and we cannot do that. And also, that's not healthy for us either, because then it becomes about us as opposed to the person that we're serving. So to have compassion, to have sympathy, is that we can have an understanding of where they are from our perspective, because it's always from our perspective. And empathy means kind of taking on that other individual's feelings. And even if we do, we're not taking anything away from them. All we're doing is adding to ourselves. And again, it becomes more about us. So I encourage compassion as opposed and sympathy as opposed to empathy as far as a practice.
Well, Krista, thank you so much for being with us today. I hope you'll come back, and
I
I
would love
hope that
to.
our participants will take advantage of OVCT Tech and go for one of these trainings for your organization. Thank
Thank
you
you all so
so
much.
much.
Again, my gratitude to you all.
Thank you, Krista.